Trinity prank. Also, the Pope decided today to release Vatican-related bath products. An incredible thing. Yes, it's the new Pope.
Hello, everyone. We are back with another episode of Timeless Dialogues, and I know what many of you are probably thinking to yourselves, but you are worthy for another one. And what we're going to do today is we're going to consider this major topic of what is ideology? How do we understand it? What can we do with it? But what I want to do is understand it in a little different format than some ways that you're probably used to. Namely, I want to go through and see how Jordan Peterson understands both the psychological and the practical effects of the way ideology can work. So let's start with this opening quote, and then we've got a lot more to go into here. So he starts off by his book here titled Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. In the final section on ideology reads, have some humility, clean up your bedroom, take care of your family, follow your conscience, straighten up your life, find something productive and interesting to do and commit to it. When you can do all that, find a bigger problem and try to solve that if you dare. And if that works too, move on to even more ambitious projects. And as the necessary beginning to that process, abandon ideology. Now, we all are incredibly aware of the effects of ideology. We see it happening virtually everywhere, whether it's going to be from the ideologies of Marxism or Leninism or environmentalism or feminism with feminazis and Nazism or all the other isms and schisms that take place today. And the reason that we see so much of it is that we live in an ideologically driven world. So what I want to do today, how I want you to see this, is I want you to be equipped so you can understand how does it actually grow? Like, how do they get from point A to point B to point C? It's not just that ideology exists. It's certain types of ideologies that are so blinding upon us. And what we're going to do is we're going to understand how it comes about, and then we're going to finish by applying it to like 5 or 6 different areas here. So let's just kind of like jump in here with a little bit of an evaluation with Peterson's whole concept here. So how I want us to do this is I want us to start out and we're going to read a section of it and then we're going to discuss it, because my goal here is to not just entertain or do goofy things or say goofy things, but to truly try to equip you so that you can understand what is going on in the broader ideological sense of the word. Now, when it comes to some of these things, you might be thinking, but what I want you to notice is that there's just a lot of things that are important here that we need to see so that you can engage in the world that we're in. So let's start out here. His first book here, or second book here, is Beyond Order. And notice what he says here. He says, consider those who have not gone so far as to adopt the discredited ideologies of Marxism or Marxist-Leninists and the Nazis, but who still maintain faith in the commonplace isms characterizing the modern world. So think about what he's trying to say here. You don't have to go so far as to be a radical Marxist or a Leninist or a Nazi in order to be driven by all of these different ideologies. In fact, he's going to say that there are sometimes lesser forms of them. Now they can govern you in strong and passionate ways, but they're still going to capture your mind. And he gives a few of them. He says, sometimes forms of conservatism or socialism or feminism. And he goes on to say, and all manners of ethnic and gender study isms, postmodernism, and environmentalism, among others. So we see all of these, and probably the most prevalent ones are feminism and CRT, you white, racist, patriarchal, fill in the blanks, and postmodernism with their denial of the concepts of essential truths, and everything's according to varying, encompassing stories, not one big meta-narrative. And we've already seen how socialism and feminism can work its way out. But this is the key point. This is what I want you to point out to see here. He says, they are all monotheists, practically speaking, or polytheistic worshipers of a very small number of gods. And what he's going to try to argue for here is that these different ideologies can take a godlike feature. Now, you may have one that's overarching, and that would be monotheistic, or it can be one that's polytheistic, and that you are buying into a whole variety of different ideologies, and you're just appeasing whichever god may happen to come at you at that particular time. But notice this, he says, these gods are the axioms and foundational beliefs that must be accepted a priori rather than proven before the belief system can be adopted. So notice, he's giving this idea that they're functioning with an authority of which they're governing what you're to believe and how you're supposed to live that out. And he says they're axiomatic foundational beliefs that must be accepted before you do anything. So before you go out and you look at society or you look at different events that go on in the world, these axiomatic a priori, prior to experience, isms must necessarily give the structure by which knowledge must occur here. And he says that they're not proven. He says they're just something you must adopt. And he says, and when accepted and applied to the world, these things allow the illusion to prevail that knowledge has been produced. So notice they're not actually a priori. They're all given from experience. You have to learn this junk somewhere at some point in time, but they function a priori in the axiomatic way that they're the way that you are deducing and understanding all of these interpretive lenses. But notice what he says here. It's the illusion that knowledge has been produced. So all of these people, whether they're socialists or a feminist or an environmentalist, they think that they know something you don't know. And they have special insights into the world that you just don't have. So how do you get this? Put their lenses on, put their ideology on, put these different ideas on. And from that, you'll have the right sense of knowledge. So that's why he calls it a false idol. These things aren't really gods. They're easily disproven in a variety of different ways, but they function as controlling axioms that govern what you're to believe and what you're to do, and they give us the sense of superior knowledge. So let's continue looking here. He goes on to say, oh, how does it actually work? Like, what's the process? It says the process by which an ism system can be generated is simple in its initial stages, but baroque enough in its application to mimic and replace actual productive theorizing. He goes on to say, the ideologue begins by selecting a few abstractions in whose low-resolution representations hide large, undifferentiated chunks of the world. Some examples include the economy, the nation, the environment, the patriarchy, the people, the rich, the poor, the oppressed, the oppressors. The use of single terms implicitly hypersimplifies what are in fact extraordinarily diverse and complex phenomena that are mass complexity, or that mass complexity in part of the reason that the terms come to carry so much emotional weight. Translated, here's what he's trying to say is that these things start out where they're sometimes very, very simple. Notice what he's saying, that they're simple in their initial stages and baroque enough in their applications to mimic and replace real theorizing meaning. So you have these patterns, these ideas, these ways that you structurally know the world. And these things come in and they're simple. They give very clear, almost intuitive things that may seem wrong or give an explanation to what's going on. So he starts to say what's so key about these is that it's how this ideologue, how this person is actually working with you. Like we see it when it comes to a used car salesman, but how does it work at the ideological sense? You know, when we teach philosophy, we try to understand how these ideologies work. And he says the ideologue, notice here, begins by selecting a few abstractions and then tries to just throw them into the world without any different things. So for example, notice what he says here. We're used to this idea of the oppressed and the oppressors. So you're struggling in life. Well, it's because you're oppressed. Well, what are you oppressed by? People that are richer than you, or the patriarchy, or white men maybe is why you're not there. And you're thinking, man, sometimes, you know, this guy got a job before me, or the rich kid went on the vacation and I wasn't able to do it. So see what I mean? You see how it's this small little simple explanation. And what they do is they give it over explanatory power and authority. And that becomes the lens by which you interpret everything. Notice he says that's the use of the single terms implicitly hypersimplifies what in fact are extraordinarily diverse and complex phenomena. So for example, when we try to look at the issue of like why people are poor, it's not just they're oppressed. It could be you had a car accident and you lost everything. It could be an issue of your parents died and you had no means of somebody to provide for you. It could be something along the lines of the factory burned down last week, so nobody in your community has a job. The point is that it's not just oppression or the patriarchy. Sometimes there's a variety of factors that go into explaining one issue. So why this is so important is that they try to give you one or two, usually not a variety of explanatory factors, so that they can focus on them. They problematize them. And that's the initial part of the process. So let's keep going here. So how does the ideologue do this? They do it by giving us false causal factors. So we know what a cause is. You know, if you're going to go out and you're going to wash your car and the car's clearly wet, well, what was the cause of that? You. Well, what was the cause of you giving that to you? The hose. Well, what gives the hose that? The pipe that's from the road to your house into the hose into the car. We understand how causes happen. You throw a baseball into the window breaks. What's the cause of that? That's you. So a false causal factor is something that makes this idea that it's giving the origin or it's the source, it's the advent of it, but it's totally false and made up. It's used as a means of controlling you, not of real explanatory significance. So notice what he says here. It says, since the ideologue can place him or herself on the morally correct side of the equation without the genuine effort necessary to do so validly, it is much easier and more immediately gratifying to reduce the problem to something simple and accompany it with an evildoer who can then be morally opposed. So notice this. The whole point of the ideology is to give you knowledge, but it's not just knowledge. It's that when you have this knowledge, you have some kind of moral superiority to it. You see the world in a way and the causal factors of the world in a way that makes you somehow more virtuous than another individual. And if you don't have this, you're lacking the virtue that you, yes, you should have. So we've seen this happen a variety of times. You know, if you see the inherent racism or the unconscious bias that's in this situation, then you're morally superior. You see justice. You see the morally virtuous act or the morally virtuous sacrifice of the situation. But what they do is that it's gratifying, it's easier, but it's usually very reductionistic. It doesn't actually explain what's going on in the situation. Now, it goes on to say this. Peterson says, after breaking the world into large, undifferentiated pieces, describing the problem or problems that characterize each division, and identifying the appropriate villains, the ism theorist then generates a small number of explanatory principles or forces, which may indeed contribute in some part to the understanding or existence of those abstract entities. Then he or she grants to that small number primary causal power while ignoring others of equal or greater importance. It is most effective to utilize a major motivational factor or system or large-scale sociological fact or conjecture for such a purpose. So, some of the things that we look at is, how does Marxism function? What it's going to do is it's going to break these things into these large, massive categories that are going on in a sociological and a historical and sometimes an economic sense, and they're going to just reduce them to these very basic ideas. And notice what they're going to do. And they're going to start giving these undifferentiated things, and they're going to describe these problems: oppressors and oppressed, capital, money, riches. All of these different things are the reason that you're in the position that you're in, but it's also a way of explaining all the different types of people. Or look at how Mao did it. You've got those who are in the black team and those who are on the red team. Are you good with the government or are you bad with the government? If once you've been differentiated into this, everything is interpreted through that. You've got to be on the right team. You've got to be an oppressor or the oppressed. You got to be on the red or you got to be on the black. And what this is going to do is it's going to give explanatory factors to this. So, for example, you didn't get into college that you wanted. Well, maybe it's because you didn't follow what the government told you to. You didn't follow what the CCP said. And because of that, you are not somebody that we validly want to let into our educational system. And because of that, you're not going to get the job that you want. See, if you just would have followed what the ism or the ideology would have told you, you would have been in a morally appropriate place. for us to send you to that college. But the whole reason you didn't get in was because of that. And we can give a lot of examples about this. So the only reason that you didn't get the job is because the patriarchy is holding you down. I know you've worked hard and I know you've done all of these different things to boost your resume and all these things that you've done of maybe serving in your community or whatever it is. But the reason you didn't get it was because of the patriarchy. The reason you didn't get that raise was because of whiteness. The reason you didn't get it was because the earth is too warm. You see how they're starting to do this? These isms, these small explanatory factors, which sometimes it could be a case, it could be a factor, but sometimes it's not the factor, or it's even functionally like a false causal power. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to give this large scale motivational factor, interpretive lens by which the ideologue can keep explaining why you're in the position that you're in. Now, let's continue looking here. It goes on to say this, and it's also good to select those explanatory principles for an unstated, negative, resentful, and destructive reason, and then make discussion of the later, namely the destructive reasons for this, and the reason for the existence taboo for the ideologue and his or her followers, to say nothing of the critics. Notice this, then the Fox theorist spins a post hoc theory about how every phenomenon, no matter how complex, can be considered a secondary consequence of the new totalitizing system. And finally, a school of thought emerges to propagate the method or methods of this algorithmic reduction, particularly when the thinker is hoping to attain dominance in the conceptual and real worlds. And those who refuse to adopt the algorithm or who criticize its use are tacitly or explicitly demonized. So let's jump into this and let's see, let's give an example or two of how he actually does this. So bear with me as we turn to this, and he's going to give us a couple of great examples here of what it starts to look like here. Let's continue here. So let's look at the one that Freud gives us, because I think it's probably one that it doesn't give as much clash as, say, Marxism or any of the others. So he goes on to say this. Freud, as we noted, attempted to, notice this, reduce motivation to sexuality, to your libido. The same can be done quite effectively by anyone sufficiently literate, intelligent, and verbally fluent. This is because sexuality, like any multifaceted single term, can be defined as tightly or as loosely as necessary by those who use it for comprehensively explanatory purposes. No matter how defined, sex is crucially important, or a crucially important biological phenomenon, key to complex life itself, and its influence may therefore be genuinely detected or plausibly invented in any important field of endeavor and then exaggerated, while other factors of significant import are diminished in importance. In this manner, the single explanatory principle can be expanded indefinitely in keeping with its demands placed upon it. So let's go back here. Let's look at what he's trying to say here. Notice this. They select those explanatory principles for an unstated, negative, resentful, destructive reason. So why are you in this situation? The ideology is going to give you why you're in the negative position that you're in. And notice this, the reason that some of these say these described problematic issues of sexuality and the drives that you have, he's going to say, then this ideologue will make discussion of the later, the destructive factors of this, and the reason for their existence taboo for the ideologue and his or her followers to say. And then this theorist spins this post hoc theory about how every phenomenon, no matter how complex, can be considered a secondary consequence of the new totalitizing system. So let's look at this. Look at what goes on here. He goes on to explain this, and I think it's good to look at how it's going to work related to Marxism. We understand how Marx and Freud and different class struggles, but he goes, regardless of its hypothetical virtues, however, the implementation of Marxism was a disaster everywhere it was attempted, and that has motivated attempts by its unrepentant would-be present-day adherents to clothe its ideas in new garb and continue forward, as if nothing of significance has changed. Thinkers powerfully influenced by Marx and overwhelmingly influential in much of the academy today, such as Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, modified the Marxist simplification essentially by replacing economics with power, as if power were the single motivating force behind all human behavior, as opposed to, say, to competent authority or reciprocity of attitude and action. So let's continue looking here. So let's give an example of this, what it may look like, this illustration of the ideologue. How do they actually do it? So Peterson says this: incompetent and corrupt intellectuals, and go figure, the academy, thrive on such activity, such games. They know what they're doing. They're playing the theory out over and over and over again. The first players of a given game of this sort are generally the brightest participants. They weave a story around their causal principle of choice, demonstrating how that hypothetically primary motivational force profoundly contributed to any given domain of human activity. Sometimes this is even helpful, as such activity may shed light on how a motivation heretofore taboo to discuss or consider might play a large role in affecting human behavior and perception than was previously deemed acceptable. This is what happened, for example, when Freud and his emphasis on sex. So, it's taboo to talk about sex. You can't talk about these sexual drives for the reason you go to the grocery store. It's because you want to see the beautiful woman that's there. Or what reason do you really have going out for the job? Is it because you want capital, or is it because of a sexual desire or sexual craving that you're longing for? So it may have been taboo at one point, but no. Through Freud's sexual analysis of all things, it's no longer taboo. It's explanatory. It's actually one of these kind of things that if you see what's going on, you have true morally superior knowledge into the world in which we live. So now it's no longer taboo. So then these people find these followers, and says they're followers, desperate to join a potentially masterable new dominance hierarchy, those who buy into the theory and who see the world. Notice the old one being cluttered by its current occupants, become enamored of that story, while doing so, being less bright than those they follow. They subtly shift, contribute to, or affected to caused. The originators, grafted by the emergence of followers, start to shift their story in that direction as well, or they object, but that doesn't matter. The cult has already begun. So notice how it starts. You are being highly, completely, utterly influenced by sexual causal factors. And those sexual causal factors, they contribute to the situation that you're in. Don't you see the situation? The reason you're struggling with this is, well, maybe they do more than just contribute. They deeply affect you. They're playing such a significant role that maybe they actually caused you to do this. So why are you doing it? These internal and sometimes external and sociological causal factors are the reason, the explanation for it. Do you see how these start to work? And it can come across as oppressor and oppressed, racial consciousness and systemic racism. It can come about as classical liberalism has utterly failed, and you're either going to have that or you're going to have this whole issue of transgenderism in the streets, or Christian nationalism, or whatever ism or schism that they want. What they're trying to do is they're trying to give this new dominance hierarchy. Interpret this through this lens. The old needs to be gone. But notice what they're doing. It's not like they're undoing the old. They're not dealing with every factor that's going on. They're giving false or half-hearted or incomplete causal explanations for situations that we're living in. And in this, people start to buy into it. The followers start to get into it. And the ideologues start to expand their theory. It starts to cover more and more. And notice what he goes on to say here. This is how cults begin. These people tell you what to believe. You're morally superior if you believe them. They give explanatory power. How do you get it? You got to keep going to them. So a new situation arises. If you don't automatically see the interpretation, you got to go to the theory. You got to go to the ism, and it's going to give you the explanatory understanding of what's going on. So let's continue. What does this do? Let's keep illustrating this. Peterson goes on to say, this kind of theorizing is particularly attractive to people who are smart but lazy. Cynicism serves as an aid too, as does arrogance. So, man, don't you see it? It's happening everywhere. It's happening in every sense. The new adherents will be taught that mastering such a game constitutes education and will learn to criticize alternative theories and different methods, and increasingly, even the idea of fact itself. So think about what he's trying to say here is that you get cynical, arrogant people. And now if you add it in Twitter and they blow it up, oh, you see what's going on here. If you don't do this, this will happen. And oh, they're arrogant in the way that they're going to bring it about. And you're buying into this and you're the truly educated ones. But notice how they start to give this. What happens if you differ with them? You're not their friend, but you're their enemy. You can't criticize this. You can only criticize alternative theories. Don't criticize theory, the theory itself, only alternatives. Don't allow for different methods. And notice how facts don't really matter. You can't deal with counterexamples in this. Facts are gone. Truth is dead. Why? Theory functions as all. Now do you see why he starts to call it a monotheistic or a polytheistic system that functions with this God's eye view, explanatory factor with authority, and maybe even a concept of revelation given to it, namely, the theory itself. And he goes on to say this when he's talking about it. If an impenetrable vocabulary accompanies the theory, so much the better. It will then take potential critics some valuable time even to learn to decode the arguments. Think about this. In the rise of, say, 2016 through 2020 till now, how many people really understood the governing terms of critical theory, whether it be critical race theory, critical feminist theory, critical fat theories, whatever the critical blank theory is? We were always left in these definitional games and we didn't understand what was going on. Well, he says there's a reason for this. Because one, the vocabulary was difficult enough that we actually didn't really understand what was going on. And this was one of the cruxes of what was going on within many religious denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention. They didn't actually understand what critical race theory was. People hadn't really discussed that issue very much. They just kind of bought into it. They weren't able to decode the language, hence they weren't able to decode the arguments. That's how cults work in so many different ways. You don't actually understand what the Jehovah's Witness or the Mormon means by Jesus Christ or atonement or salvation. And they give you these nuanced ideas, but you got to learn the code language. You got to learn the cult language in this regard. Goes on to say this, and there is a conspiratorial aspect that rapidly comes to pervade the school where such education occurs and where such activity is increasingly all that is permitted. Do not criticize the theory and do not get singled out. Do not become unpopular. Listen to what the theory says. Be the friend of the system. Fall into it. This is where the authoritarian power starts to come in. So it starts off with a very reductionistic concept, false explanatory factors, maybe a variety of very weak reductionistic and multiple explanatory factors, but they're never comprehensive. And then, like we were saying here, the re-education process begins. And then the friend-enemy distinction begins. Notice this, he goes, even do not receive a bad grade or a poor review for expressing a taboo opinion. What's going to actually give you the bad grade? Disagreeing with them. And even when this does not occur in practice, the fear that it might keeps many students and professors or employees and employers in check. If you differ with us, if you're outside of where you're supposed to be, if you're differing with the ideology, with the ism, you're on the bad kids team. You're out. You're either in the reds or the blacks. You're either with the government or you're against the government. You're either an oppressor or you're the oppressed. You're either the person who's doing the systemic racism or you're receiving it. You're either a good white or a dirty, vain, racist white. You see how these things start to give these explanatory concepts to it? So notice what he's going to do. He's going to give us what's known as ideological reduction. So we've seen the features here. Let's keep going here. I want you to see how this works. See how the psychological aspects of this work. Ideological reduction of that form is the hallmark of these figures, most dangerous of pseudo-intellectuals. Ideologues are the intellectual equivalent of fundamentalists, unyielding and rigid. Their self-righteous and moral claim to social engineering is every bit as deep and dangerous. Might even be worse. Ideologues lay claim to rationality itself, So they try to justify their claims as logical and rational. So it's not just a religious thing that's coming upon you. This is what qualifies as a true knowledge claim. This is what it means to be rational. This is what it means to rightly understand the world, is through this ideology. So then he goes on to say, for the ideologue, however, nothing remains outside understanding or mastery. An ideological theory explains everything. Notice this: all the past, all the present, and all the future. This means the ideologue can consider him or herself in possession of the complete truth, something forbidden to the self-consistent fundamentalist. There's no claim more totalitarian and no situation in which the worst excess of pride are more likely to manifest themselves. And not only pride, but then deceit, once the ideology has failed to explain the world or predict its future. Now, one of the things that he looks at is that when it comes to religious fundamentalism, there's always this idea that God knows more than you do, and that we may not have the complete picture, and that maybe we haven't seen it clearly, or maybe sin has blinded us. With these ideologues, they have the fundamentalist spirit, but they have this totalitarian knowledge that's given to them. It's comprehensive. They're in possession of complete, absolute truth in that regard, all knowledge. And what this does is that if you proverbially know everything, or if the theory knows proverbially everything, then you're the go-to person. You're the leader, which is always the theory. Doesn't that sound very godlike? Doesn't that sound like maybe if there's two or three of them, very polytheistic in what he was trying to say? And notice, this is one of the most totalitarian things that we can give. Why? Because it gives full explanatory power and authority to the system. The system gives you everything, explains everything, provides everything. So let's keep going here. What's the moral of the story? What's the whole point of this? The moral of the story, says Peterson, is beware of intellectuals who make a monotheism out of their theories of motivation. Beware, in more technical terms, of blanket, univariate, namely single variable, causes for diverse, complex problems. Of course, power plays a role in history, as does economics, but the same can be said of jealousy, love, hunger, sex, cooperation, revelation, anger, disgust, sadness, anxiety, religion, compassion, disease, technology, hatred, and chance, none of which can definitively be reduced to another. The attraction of doing so is, however, obvious: simplicity, ease, and the illusion of mastery. So you can figure it out very easily and understand this, which can have exceptionally useful psychological and social consequences, particularly in the short term. And let us not forget the frequent discovery of a villain or set of villains upon which the hidden motivations of the ideology can be vented. So you find out who your friends are and who your enemies are. You've got a very simple explanation. And when things aren't going bad, you demonize and villainize these people that are contrary to you. Doesn't this feel like the world in which we live? Very simple explanations, these reductionistic ideas that start in the academy, that try to give these very, very vague, simple explanations for why everything is the way that it is and the situation that you're in. And if you differ with me, you're a villain. When the reality is that this is how the ideological cult functions. Why are they villainizing you? Because you differed with the cult. You've differed with the gods on this particular factor. So what do? We abandon ideology. So let's give a few examples of these. He says, like, Freud's reduction of all motivation to sexuality. Very simple explanation. If you differ with it, you're pent up with whatever, but it's a simple explanatory faction. Marxist fundamental reduction to economic and class struggles, dialectical materialism, or environmentalism's fundamental redoing of all society under the banner of the environment. The world is getting hotter, so we need to pass new laws in order to ban you from driving cars. Why? The environment. We know that it gets hot during the summertime, deathly hot during the summertime, but we need you to go in and buy into our new policy here, in which we will give you a discount on your electrical bill if you allow us to install our certain thermostats in your house, of which we can control. Why? The environment is the reason that you need to do this. Or everybody needs to transition to electric vehicles, even though the batteries cost more money, and even though the batteries do more harm to the world. We're not going to explain this. And even though most of these batteries are harvested in certain areas that you would be not so happy to know about from people who are doing work that you don't want to, but it's for the environment. Once you see the ism and the reductionistic aspects of it and the explanatory power, or you differ with me, villain, terrible, or critical race theory, systemic unconscious biases and racial biases. The reason I got pulled over is because I'm black. And the reason you don't have a problem with it is because you're white. You just don't see it. You don't have the right perspectives. You don't have the right moral intuitions. Or the reason that you see justice in this situation is because I just know justice. It's axiomatic. I see it. I know it. I grasp it. Nothing more. Or feminism's reduction of all problems to the patriarchy. The reason that I didn't get the job, patriarchy. The reason I can't change the tire on my car, patriarchy. The reason that I burnt the toast or the eggs or the pizza is because the patriarchy didn't put the right labels on. We know how this stuff goes. Or what about one of the more famous ones today, Christian nationalism, coming about from figures on the right with the reduction of all problems to, we'll say, liberalism, which is wrongly associated with progressivism. So what I'm trying to say there is they're saying classical liberalism is the cause of all of these things. So drag queens, classical liberalism. Why? Because we've got to allow the freedom of everybody's thoughts here, regardless. You know, this is what you get. You just accept a Christian nationalism. You wouldn't have this going on anymore. Or, you know, why do we have all of these issues going on with sexuality within our society? Classical liberalism. Or the ideas that fill in the blank, whatever they're giving. And what's going on here is this is exactly what Peterson's talking about. Very basic explanatory factors, false causal factors that are wrongly being attributed to these situations, and they're functioning like ideologies with a godlike import to them. So what do? You abandon ideologies in this regard. You see them for what they are. You don't allow them to give explanatory, causal understanding and factors to the world in which we live. So that's why we started out this whole thing with this quote here. Have some humility. Maybe your ism or your schism is wrong. And that's why we went on to say this. Clean up your room. Clean up your act before you try cleaning up everybody else's act. Take care of your family. Follow your conscience. Straighten up your life. Find something productive and interesting to do and commit to it. When you can do all of that, find a bigger problem and try to solve that if you dare. If it works too, move on to more ambitious projects. And the necessary beginning to that process is abandon ideology. And you're saying, well, I'm doing this. I'm doing this. Don't you see it? I am trying to come out. I am coming out and I am fixing the problem that you are finding yourself in. Are you? Or are you buying into ideology and ideology is just working its way through over and over and over again? And that's why I put this tweet out recently that kind of flipped out a few people where I was trying to draw the significance between what actually went on in Germany, Russia, and China when they were taken over by their forms of communism and socialism, and maybe even other places with their fascism. And I was saying what they're doing is they're using a Hegelian dialectic. The ideology is what's giving it, and they all lost it. Why? Because this particular theory is using a Hegelian dialectic. No, I'm not doing this. I guarantee 99% of them have not actually read Hegel, specifically Hegel's philosophy of right and the way that his metaphysic ties into his philosophy of history, but also the way the dialectic works, and you create a buzz horizontally to achieve your end vertical goal. And this is specifically what goes on. You look at oppressor-oppressed totalitarianism, red versus black, Marxist totalitarianism, all the things that went on in the propaganda campaigns within Germany and all this. You make sociological issues that go on, these basic concepts of systemic racism, and you say it and you don't. Critical race theory, feminisms, the way that Christian nationalists have done it in all these different regards. These are mainly people on the right. So what I want you to see here is that we don't want to buy into these ideologies. We don't want to be an ideologue. Don't give the gods their power. Or, in other words, as something the Bible might say, thou shalt have no other gods before me.
All was a fraternity prank. Also, the Pope decided today to release Vatican-related bath products. An incredible thing. Yes, it's the new Pope on a rope. That's right. Pope
False.
on a rope. Wash with it, go straight to heaven. Thank you.
Shark, I'm the electric guy.